Hi, and welcome to another episode of Sand Hill Road, the show where I talk to successful startup founders and venture capitalists about the companies that they build and invest in. And the goal, like always, is to give you a sense of what it's like to be in their shoes, how their businesses tick, how they got to where they are, and to learn from their many successes and mistakes. And today I'm thrilled to be joined by Lee Edwards.
I hope I don't end up in trouble for it someday.
Who is a partner at Root Ventures. Lee has a very diverse, both technical and operational background, which I think uniquely qualifies him for his role at Root Ventures. Before joining Root last year, he most recently was the CTO of Teespring. And before that, he held positions both as a mechanical and as a software engineer at startups such as Pivotal Labs, iRobot, and SiteTour. Root Ventures is a San Francisco-based hard or frontier tech venture firm which has closed its first $30 million fund back in 2015. And it has closed its second fund last year in 2018 with LP commitments totaling exactly $76.7269 million. Why this exact number, you may ask? Well, because Root Ventures is composed of real engineering nerds. And 767.269 miles per hour is the speed of sound in dry air at 20 degrees Celsius. And it is exactly this kind of engineering mindset and attitude that sets the tone at Root Ventures. And it's also the reason why Lee decided to join the firm last year. But let's hear it from Lee himself and let's jump right in. All right, I'm super excited to be joined today by Lee Edwards, who is a partner at Root Ventures. And before we begin, I want to give Lee a lot of credit for being one of the first people to agree to be on my show, way before I did my first recording. I've done a bunch of them now, but he, without seeing any of my content, he agreed right away. So he was really an early backer of the show before it was a show. So a lot of credit to you. And before I want to dive into the work that you do at Root Ventures, I want to take a step back and really find out who is Lee. So you have a bit of an unusual background in that you are both a software engineer and a mechanical engineer. I think when you first graduated from Olin College with a degree in systems engineering, you actually took a role as a mechanical engineer at iRobots. And it was only later that you basically retrained as a software engineer and held various positions in startups like Pivotal Labs, SiteTour, and Groupon Live. And most recently, you were the CTO of Teespring, which is a Series B stage startup in San Francisco in the apparel industry, and which operates a little bit at the intersection of software and hardware. And I think if I met you 2 years ago, I would have said that you're the perfect technical co-founder for a startup, and that's really at this intersection of software and hardware. But instead, you decided to go from the operator role into a venture capital role. So take us back to that moment. And I mean, I know that you were an angel investor in the companies such as Skydio, Lever, and Enzyme before that. But what really was your decision process when you decided to join Root Ventures?
So I had been angel investing in some friends' companies, and that's where some of those companies you mentioned came about. So it was something I was kind of doing opportunistically, which I think happens to a lot of people out here in the Valley when your friends start companies and you want to support them, or maybe you have a set of expertise that they want to bring you in on the cap table. So I was doing that, and Bloomberg Beta, which is Bloomberg LP's corporate venture arm, actually offered to start backing my investments by putting me into their scout program. So I started basically doing that to just bring more capital into companies that were already in my network. But when I started kind of spending nights and weekends on it and trying to source companies and finding companies like Dipsy Stories, which is doing audio romance novels for women, and I invested in Daisy, which is a London-based company founded by Maisie Williams that's working on essentially how to disintermediate agents and folks out of Hollywood and let the creatives kind of get closer to their audience. I found that I really enjoyed that. And so I felt if I had more time, I could do more of it and I could do a better job of it. So Teespring was in a good place at that point, about January of last year. And there's stuff in the press you can read about it. We went through a lot of tough times, but we definitely pulled out on the other side. So I felt comfortable leaving and kind of focusing on investing full time. And my original plan was to kind of do this on my own, and maybe start my own small fund. And I invested in a company called Esper as an angel that is much closer to the area that I'm investing in now. They're sort of enterprise operating system and development tools set for essentially Android devices, touchscreen devices. So you can think about touchscreens on refrigerators or on cars, or even not touchscreen devices like Amazon Alexa actually runs on Android. And so what's the flavor of Android that is not for consumers? It's actually for enterprise, and a set of cloud services and tools that you need to actually have an effective development process. So invested in that company, actually committed very early. I think I might have been the first commitment. And then Root Ventures ended up leading the round. And Avidan, the general partner at Root, called me in and was trying to figure out if I was a worthwhile angel to have on the cap table or if he should throw me out. And so I wouldn't let him throw me out. And we ended up kind of talking over a period of time and decided to try out the relationship as a venture partner. So I did that basically August through December of last year. And then by January, decided I wanted to join full time. So it had a nice advantage of, I think, moving from operator to venture. Not everyone likes it. I know a lot of people that have started to do it, and then they decide to leave venture pretty quickly when they realize that they're much more interested in kind of hands-on building. And I had a year to basically spend doing that myself. And being an investor at a fund is very, very different from being an angel investor in many ways, but at least had the opportunity to figure out, like, do I want to work with founders in this way versus, being an engineer or manager or even an executive or founder at a startup. So there's no shock to me, the past year of being a partner at Root.
Yeah, that's interesting. From almost being kicked off the cap table to joining the leader of the round, right? Now let's talk a little bit about Root Ventures. It's in the great scheme of things, it's a pretty young firm. It raised its first fund in 2015, and it has this really unique investment thesis, I think, on hard tech, which I think you talked about this somewhere else. If you think about the history of venture capital, it is meant to finance what would not be financed otherwise. And in that sense, I really like this thesis of Root Ventures, which is trying to do exactly that. And maybe let's start with the name. So Root Ventures, it is a reference to the sudo or super user in the Unix computer system. So what does this mean concretely for founders? That founders have to give you root access once you invest, or that you get really into the weeds of the software architecture? What is the message to founders there, and what is Root Ventures all about?
Yeah, well, we definitely don't require super user access. I think we're happy with a managed account and letting the founders run their own root account. But like that you caught the reference, not everyone does. The obvious other thing, right, is the roots of a tree. So if you see our logo, and it's actually silver traces on a black PCB, but it's in the shape of a tree. We all come from an engineering background, and I think actually all of us have at least touched a little bit of a few different disciplines of engineering. So I think the founders that we work with get the joke, know what root is. Although what we have found is that Australian founders have a different definition for what root means, which is vulgar. And that's not something I think Avidan thought about when he picked the name. So the firm is about 6 years old. We're on fund 2. And the first set of that we call sort of Fund 0, the set of 6 SPVs that Avidan sort of raised and invested directly. A lot of venture firms kind of get this start this way. If the fund manager is a first-time manager, they're often doing angel investments, bringing in people to back them, kind of like the path that I was going down. So some of those investments included Particle, which is internet-connected microcontroller, which just announced a large Series C, and Creator, which is a hamburger-making robot that is doing quite well. Khosla Ventures has invested a lot since then. Basically, the idea has always been technical founders, technical problems. What's interesting is we tend to be known for doing hardware because we do hardware. And I think most firms shy away from it. As you were saying, I think that some capital in Silicon Valley is kind of averse to technical risk. And maybe that's okay. I mean, if the partners at those firms don't have that background and they feel like they're better aligned towards understanding risk and helping founders in other spaces like commercialization, go-to-market, that kind of stuff, that's great. They should stay out of deep tech. We like hard problems of all kinds. Even back to the name root, it's a computer science term. So we actually have a number of companies that are pure software, and that's really where I'm going to be focusing.
Let's talk a little bit about your personal investment sweet spot now. And I saw on your website that you are focusing on hard software. I'm quoting from your website here: tools and services for engineers and data scientists, software infrastructure, AI, machine learning, computer vision, and AR and VR. So, I mean, this sounds really daunting, and it surely scares away all the dating apps and the productivity apps, but it's still like a huge space. So maybe you can narrow it down a little bit, what your personal deal flow funnel looks a little bit like.
Yeah, it's interesting that definitely is the case. When you kind of put that out there, I think a big part of a venture firm on the newer side is trying to build something that is a clear message that founders will come to you when they're in this space, or that other investors will think of you when they're looking for someone to lead or co-lead one of their investments. So yeah, I mean, I'm interested. The past couple investments I've done, I can't quite talk about yet, but both are in what I would call, well, one is in what I would call sort of data science enablement or AI enablement tooling for building a specific set of data science tools and models. And the other one is more on the data engineering side, solving one of the biggest problems that exists in data engineering that most data engineers think can't really be solved. Excited about that kind of stuff. I mean, I'm essentially doing 2 to 3 investments per year. I've been at the firm for a year. So stuff that I expect to be doing and looking at in the future. Definitely interested in other kinds of applied AI. So a couple companies in our portfolio that are kind of like this already. Instrumental is a company that's doing computer vision that sits at the end of a factory line. So products that come off of the line, it can detect anomalies or defects. And what's really amazing about what they're doing with computer vision and anomaly detection is that they can train a model on 20 images. So it can be very useful for the kind of factory line where products are changing throughout the day. And so is really useful for, say, like NPI, like new product introduction, or kind of like prototype level manufacturing where the quality systems are pretty early. Another company called Tortuga that's using computer vision for robots that detect and pick strawberries out of the farm. So that I would call a hardware company. Instrumental is, the other thing is I think a lot of times people think that something's a hardware company if it involves hardware, but I tend to think of Instrumental as a software company. They didn't have any mechanical engineers when they got started. The sort of cameras off the shelf, the fixture that holds the camera was off the shelf, and certainly down the line they'll start building a little bit more of that. But it's really driven by software, and the same is true of Particle. It happens to provide a microcontroller that's connected to the internet, and when they got started, they had sort of the highest performing, lowest cost one. But what Zach Sapala, the CEO, did that was really smart was he anticipated anytime you make something like that, it's going to get copied in this environment, this global economy. There really isn't any proprietary PCB. So sure enough, yeah, there's lots of stuff out there in China that's low cost or lower cost. But what Particle's really selling, where they're making their money, is the software services built around it. Mm-hmm. So another company called Entopology that's doing generative CAD design. So they're pure software for mechanical engineers that are doing advanced materials, advanced manufacturing, and advanced geometries in ways that traditional CAD applications like SolidWorks and ProEngineer, Autodesk don't do a good job of. They're not designed for this. They're sort of, you can think of them as essentially declarative modeling, whereas Entopology is kind of constraints based. So solve this equation, minimize the weight of this solid given this set of thermal properties and convection equation. So what it's doing is actually pretty insane, and the customers are amazing. We're not allowed to talk about most of them. They're doing really, really advanced stuff.
Very interesting. So let's talk about another segment that you've been looking at, which is the commercial open source segment. And I want to start the discussion. I want to kick off the discussion with a tweet of yours that I really like. And so basically, you're quoting there someone saying that Silicon Valley profits off of open source and doesn't contribute back. And then you basically wrote that, I don't know how much value you think React, TensorFlow, Kubernetes, Airflow, Golang have added to the OSS community, but there's bigger impact to be made than closing issues on other people's projects. I really like this tweet because we've had a lot of discussion about value contribution in open source. Obviously, with cloud providers moving quite heavily into this space, with the whole Redis and AWS discussion, the whole Commons class discussion. We had the announcement today from Docker basically selling their enterprise solution, and their show got stolen from Kubernetes once Google open sourced Kubernetes, right? But I think your tweet brought to the fore something new that I haven't heard in that sense, and that's really the geolocal contribution level. And if I can play devil's advocate here for a second and push back a little bit on your tweet, one could say that open source is this genius way of Silicon Valley to basically crowdsource a lot of the code base across the world, but still retain much of the monetization layer in Silicon Valley. And I'm thinking of projects like React. Obviously, it's used in other projects, but a lot of it is still monetized through Facebook. Or think about things like Kafka, which came out of LinkedIn and is still heavily monetized by LinkedIn. Obviously, they're also doing a lot of contributions. My argument here being that there's a geolocal dimension to this whole value contribution. So talk to me a little bit about how you view that.
Yeah, I mean, I think that it's certainly the case that open source was sort of started like well outside of Silicon Valley. I mean, I think it was much more distributed teams. If you look at GNU and things like that, what I think has been interesting to see is the kinds of innovation that's coming out of places like Google, kind of less so Apple to some extent. Although, I mean, well, actually, that's an interesting one to see, right? It's them moving from Objective-C to Swift and open sourcing Swift. Really interesting trend, right? Microsoft moving from proprietary, like in the 90s, right? That was the whole deal is proprietary everything. And so now, well, Microsoft owns GitHub, but it's also been open sourcing a lot of their libraries and frameworks and working a lot better with the community. So these companies could hang on to this IP. You could imagine Google saying, AI is so important. Why would we release TensorFlow? It's just kind of getting rid of our competitive advantage. So I think that you might look at that and say, hey, well, it seems like Google is crowdsourcing their development. But I don't view it that way. I think partly because I don't think that really works. I've been at companies where, people who are not engineers have sort of suggested, hey, we could get a bunch of free labor if we open source this. But it doesn't work that way because you actually have to build a community. Nobody just sort of finds a project and starts contributing to it in a meaningful way. If you look at the most successful OSS projects that are out there, they have amazing communities. And when they are things like Golang that have come out of companies, the company is spending considerable resources to do the sort of developer marketing, running the conferences, paying people full time to do this. And you've seen people like Guido from Python Inventor working at Microsoft. You see Mats, who invented Ruby, working at Heroku Salesforce. So these companies are putting money into it. And if you think about the value that those projects that I listed have created in the community, it's enormous. Mm-hmm. And I think if anything, the thing to worry about is like, yeah, did Kubernetes take a lot of value away from Docker? Yeah, possibly. Who's to say where Docker goes from here, right? Divesting the enterprise business. But certainly investors and employees at Docker might sort of be upset about the existence of Kubernetes being free and available for everyone. But for the rest of us building software in the world, I think it's kind of amazing that Kubernetes is free. A lot of these projects, when you look at Kubernetes, right, I can't tell the number of times that we've basically built a buggy, more feature-barren version of Kubernetes before that came out is like enormous. Almost every company was building like a crappy Kubernetes. True. And certainly that's the case with all these JavaScript frameworks and React, right? How many times were we reinventing the JavaScript framework? And now it feels like, fingers crossed, like React may actually finally have like kind of the foothold and the staying power in the space. I guess there's kind of a knee-jerk reaction to sort of dislike large corporations. Another interesting trend that VCs will often talk about is the sort of shift from innovation in concentrated organizations. Like if you look at Bell Labs, if you look at where a lot of technology innovation was happening, 50s, 60s, 70s, really like, post-war up until kind of the first dot-com era, innovation was happening out of large companies. And then we've seen a lot of innovation coming out of startups. And I think we're starting to see in some cases a lot of innovation coming out of large companies again. And that's actually been happening for a while. But what's interesting that's different from what Bell Labs was doing is a lot of this innovation is getting sent out to the world for free. And so I'm not sure that it makes sense to invest in Golang as a language or TensorFlow as a framework, but it's interesting to look at the world and say, what can people unlock now that they have access to these technologies for free? Mm-hmm. I don't know the specific answers to those questions, or I'd be starting those companies, but I'm always looking for founders that maybe they're a domain expert in something. So like Instrumental, who I mentioned, Anne Shedletsky, the founder, is an expert at supply chain. She was at Apple. The availability of cheap, easy, free computer vision models that you can build, that compile, that you can retrain. She didn't have to build any of that from scratch. She just needed to be a domain expert in supply chain. That's what I'm looking for out there. I think that as that bar of what what is easy for people to implement? What do they sort of get for free? That unlocks so much potential for people that have to know kind of less than they would have had to know before.
So let's talk a little bit about the different business models in open source. The three main business models are the services business model, pioneered by Red Hat, which lacks a little bit in scalability, but oftentimes open source companies start out with this. Then there's obviously the open core model, and there's the SaaS model. How do you think about, both in terms of defensibility and also in terms of scalability, how do you think about these different business models?
I think that they kind of have different applications. They have sort of different pros and cons depending on the application. So I think the services model is an interesting one where, even though you see companies, like you mentioned, Red Hat as a service company, they were just acquired for double-digit billions. Kind of insane. That was a services business, and I think traditionally people think of services as not venture backable because it's scales linearly with labor. But when I think of services for these kinds of businesses, I think of services as lead gen, as ways to bring on customers and kind of understand what parts of the roadmap are important to kind of co-develop your application, and it's contract expansion. So I did a teardown of the Pivotal S1 when they IPO'd in April of last year, and I'm not an expert in any of this stuff.
I saw that.
So one thing that you can kind of pull out of that data is that Pivotal is using services to, they're landing contracts, they're getting these large customers to use the product, Pivotal Cloud Foundry and related products. They've got these companies paying for their cloud SaaS offering, which is their extremely high margin part of the business. And then also, as they're building out use cases with these customers, they're saying, hey, this new feature that we just added Pivotal Kubernetes service. Sounds like you guys could be using Kubernetes. Let's add this service on. So it's good for contract expansion. That being said, I don't know that there are too many seed stage startups that want to start with the services model, but I think it's an interesting way to think about monetizing down the line. With open core, when we talked about the tweet earlier, is a little bit of some of the backlash that people are having against folks that are commercializing open source is basically saying part of your source code is closed, part of it's open. Part that is, I think the way that I like to think about these businesses, and they're not always built the same way, but sometimes the idea behind having part of it open source is a little bit of an insurance policy for the customer, because they say, hey, well, if your company goes under, at least I've got this open source stuff and I could try to run it myself. I could host it myself. Certainly you could try to build a robust community. And I think, again, I'm not sure that that's so much about free labor and maybe more about just kind of adoption. When projects get really popular among developers and they bring them into work and they say, hey, why don't we use NPM? It seems like that's a much easier way to manage our JavaScript packages, right? All of a sudden NPM is ubiquitous. The closed part of the open core model is important because it's very possible to run and build a project that's so successful that you can't afford to maintain it anymore. Sometimes people lose sight of that when they sort of get upset about an open source company commercializing, that it actually does take money to do most of the things that are not writing code that these companies need to do, like hosting, hiring, doing marketing and conferences and that kind of thing. So I do think there's a pitfall for companies that open source too much and make it essentially impossible to monetize. So the question is kind of like, what can you open? You're dealing with this community in open source, right, that has some very core values. I think it's important what you close. Sometimes people take the approach of let's close source the really proprietary deep IP. Sometimes people will say, let's just close source the part that's strictly monetized, that maybe isn't even the important part of the business, say the hosting platform or this kind of thing, or like a dashboard or kind of the platform where you interface, right? So for example, a lot of Heroku is closed source. The build packs are open source. In theory, if you wanted to get off of Heroku, you could rebuild a lot of the stuff that they've closed source and use the build packs and get a lot of the benefit. Of course, it's kind of a pain to do that, and it's usually easier to just pay other people to do the hosting for you. And so I think that developers tend to not be super upset about that. They know that hosting costs money. They're willing to pay money for hosting. Third model you mentioned.
The SaaS model, yeah.
The SaaS model, right. Yeah, so sorry, I kind of bled between open core and SaaS, right? A great example of a SaaS model, I suppose, would be something like Segment or think of New Relic. Yeah, these are interesting businesses where, and I could be wrong, it's possible that they've open sourced some of the stuff. I think that a lot of the open source for things like New Relic is really like the client libraries, and the secret sauce is very much closed. You more or less interact with that entirely on the platform. And there's really no way to churn, right? If you're not going to use newrelic.com, you're not using New Relic, right? There's no, again, there may be some APIs to pull your data out of the New Relic APM possibly, but that's not what people are doing. They're living inside a web browser. They're living on the platform. So those can sometimes have kind of a walled garden approach. I feel like like they work. I feel like they work really well for things like the BI tools and insights and analytics. There's other good examples. I think like the Circle CI interface is really useful for people. The GitHub interface is really useful. I do think there's something remains to be seen for companies, say like Weights and Biases and folks like that are building. I'm a huge fan of Weights and Biases, and honestly kind of a huge fan of really any developer tool that's out there. But they have somewhat of like a walled garden approach, and you're seeing a lot of folks that are doing kind of more command line driven, open source driven kind of alternatives to Weights and Biases, and we'll see where that ends up. I think my bias, as I think about like what I like as a developer, and when I try out new products and test them for what I call developer ergonomics, I tend to gravitate towards things that are sort of command line code first.
So maybe let's segue to an idea that you've brought up in the past, raising the floor. And basically anything that provides the tooling to turn a 1x engineer into a 10x engineer. What used to be hard is now easy, and what used to be easy is now for free. I'm quoting you there. And I really like that. Some examples that you mentioned was that in the past, people who wanted some CMS system on the internet, they had to build their own CMS. Now they can use WordPress. If you wanted to do credit card processing on the internet, you had to build that in yourself. Now you can do it with a couple of lines of code using Stripe. The same with AI, computer vision, and TensorFlow. Obviously, in your perspective, what's the next frontier? There's a lot of talk about the no-code movement. So is no-code the new frontier of that?
Yeah, I think of there being kind of two frontiers if you sort of take the trend that I described as a given. The no-code frontier is essentially what can you do with no code whatsoever. That floor is rising all the time, right? I think we're seeing multiple YC companies that are trying to make it so you can build mobile client apps that without any code. So you can think of it as like an interface builder that actually executes and runs the mobile app. Yeah, certainly we're seeing more and more things that are in kind of the website builder space. Seeing companies that are trying to build UIs even for building machine learning models. So I don't know which ones of those will work, but I think there's always this world where as problems become more and more solved problems, as we call them, you can sort of use really clever UI UX concepts to try to make them accessible for everyone. I do think there's one thing that a lot of people forget about this floor, though, which is that more people can write code than you think. I don't like to basically say in order for something to be usable by everyone, it has to be no code. People who have journalism degrees know HTML and CSS. They have to. They use it in their job. You're seeing more and more of this. I mean, really anyone is doing some amount of computer science to graduate. Look at the number of people that are writing macros in Excel. But these people aren't really being told that they're programming. They don't really identify as like being a programmer. But their brain is working in a logical way, doing what programmers do. They're identifying a problem, they're breaking it down into its components, they're applying their own knowledge, their domain knowledge. So I'm interested in that. I do like no code, but I again find myself a little more gravitated towards what can you do with just a little bit of code? Mm-hmm. We have a company called Daily that has this very simple API that allows two-way real-time video communication. So we're on Skype now, and it's been performing really well so far. But as you know, it's actually not easy to do very reliable video that takes into account compression and latency and quality and all this stuff. That's one example. I think Twilio, Stripe, or other examples where if you went to a boot camp and you learned kind of basic programming in 6 weeks or something, and then someone showed you the Twilio, the Stripe, or the Daily API, you could just do it. And that's kind of a crazy thing to think about. Two-way video in the web browser, like say 5 years ago, right? On the other end, like what's the frontier at the top? I think there's a lot of really interesting software technology that's being built that's enabling us to do things that we never could have done before. And this stuff is, 10 years away from becoming no code or low code. It's at this point very high code and requires like really brilliant computer scientists. One thing we all look at a lot is, stuff coming out of OpenAI. I think they're doing some really interesting stuff. So I've been interested in simulation-based training. So a lot of these machine learning models, like obviously one of the huge problems in machine learning is access to large volumes of high quality data and often well-labeled data. So lots and lots of techniques about generating synthetic data, about training things on simulations. So Skydio, for example, right, is doing a lot of 3D simulations as part of training their AI algorithms. So I'm interested in that. I'm interested in a lot of the RL stuff that OpenAI is doing, their Dota AI and the way that they're doing RL-based manipulation. One thing that we talk about internally, as I said, I'm sort of focused purely on software, but I'm often talking software with my partners that are doing robotics, and they're talking to me about software and AI. I don't know that I can speak for the rest of the partners, but I personally believe that the only venture fundable robotics companies from here on forward will have deep AI on the founding team. And I think that's because this sort of procedural way of instructing robots what to do, it's not scalable anymore, and it doesn't allow them to be adaptive in the environments. So when I was at iRobot, we worked on the PackBot, right? And it's an amazing product. It's one of the highest selling military robot that's out there. It does explosive ordnance disposal, but it's essentially a remote control car. Explosive ordnance disposal, EOD team, they got to be experts at operating this thing. I'm really interested in robots where you don't have to be an expert. Certainly Skydio is in that category. What's going to enable that, I think, is going to be a lot of really sophisticated algorithms that are not procedural. They're learning model based. So I'm always interested in stuff like that. The interesting thing about investing in this part of the world, in this sort of category, is I think it's my job to kind of understand these technologies and figure out, what they're sort of capable of now and what they could be capable of in the future. When founders are solving worthwhile problems using those technologies is when we'll invest, rather than sort of saying, hey, I'm going to go out there and look for the next reinforcement learning startup. I'm kind of expecting and hoping that because reinforcement learning is so powerful, someone's going to come up with a crazy idea that wouldn't have been possible before reinforcement learning was actually a feasible technique. And again, I don't know what that idea is, or I would found that company. But last time I talked about this, I had a really amazing RL founder reach out to me. So I'm hoping I can get more of that.
Yeah, we sure hope so. So let's talk about your most recent public investment. And before we started recording this show, you were texting one of your founders on whether or not he's fine with announcing it. Maybe we have an answer by now.
He did. He just texted back, go for it. Yeah, I had an investment earlier this year that I can't talk about yet, but believe me, when it does get announced, I'll be screaming about it from the rooftops on Twitter. Yeah, so my most recent investment is in a company called Superconductive. So they're essentially commercializing their open source project, which is called Great Expectations. So the founder, Abe Gong, just gave a keynote at Data Council in New York. And the open source project has a very simple idea, which is basically you write tests for your code, right? We all think that code ought to be tested and documented. We think APIs ought to be tested and documented. We can argue about how deeply tested and how well documented, but everybody believes that, hey, if I have this software and I'm telling you to interface with it, I need to give you something a little more than the code. Data is more and more the interface these days, right? Certainly with GraphQL, understanding the data models of the service that you're interfacing with is very important. And even just internally within a company, certainly if you're in a microservices architecture, but even if you're not, even if you're using a table that someone else created and you want to know what is the temperature in Celsius or Fahrenheit, right? That's a simple one. But those of us with real world experience, we know that it can get way more complicated than that. And so Great Expectations is just a simple way. It's almost like an RSpec or a Jasmine or something like that to apply expectations to your data. So data at rest, data in motion. You can imagine using it on a development machine, pretty much every place in your infrastructure. But I think that the biggest version of this idea with kind of this simple open source foundation that I think almost every company, almost every project could be using Great Expectations. It could be as popular as Jasmine is for JavaScript. Or I guess Jasmine's not even the most popular. I always talk about Jasmine because it came out of Pivotal. So, but I think the biggest idea here is that your data, throughout your organization, from product engineers to business analysts, to the data science team, the data engineering team, even eventually the finance team, ought to have kind of unified understandings of what does this data actually mean? What is this data lineage? Where did it come from? How has it changed over time? And a lot of that stuff probably could be inferred. I think that you could ask engineers to kind of spend time essentially writing those unit tests per se. But a nice thing about data that I don't think is quite true of code yet is that inference is very possible. So if I have a stream of data coming in from a sensor and then it's piping into Kafka and it's training a machine learning model, I might notice hey, before it gets into the model, it looks like you have normalized this data between 1 and 0, or maybe you've done one hot encoding or something like that. You could kind of automatically detect what's happening to your data and sort of make the burden of maintenance lower. And so another thing that's interesting about that is I think we all have documented our services and documented our data. One big problem is that stuff becomes stale. So I look at things like Swagger that does API documentation that's actually based on your code. Swagger does not a perfect job, but it does a much better job of trying to keep your documentation actually up to date with your code. I think proponents of test-driven development would tell you that's exactly what tests do. So what if we could do that with data? What if we lower the barrier of maintaining the documentation of your data? So I think there's a lot there in terms of certain.
I had the founder of Pachyderm, JD, on recently, which is doing version control for large data sets. And so I really hear you in terms of getting to grips with these large training data sets. Let's wrap things up here. So Lee, thank you so much for being with us here today. Where can people find out more about you and find out what you're up to? I mentioned your Twitter account, which is really the perfect combination of private tweets, political tweets, startup and VC tweets. I've been following you for almost a year now. I feel like I know you as a person, which obviously is not the case.
Yeah, I mean, I think you might find even a little TMI about me on Twitter. I don't know if anyone wants to know me that well, but that's kind of been my philosophy. Is I'm just completely unfiltered on Twitter, so it is kind of like having a conversation with me. Yeah, so my Twitter is @TerronK, TerronK, and I certainly take DMs there from founders all the time. You can get a hold of me easily, Lee@root.vc, and I've got a small profile on root.vc. I also set up my personal homepage on lee.af recently, so there's not much there, but I just wanted to get the domain because I thought it was awesome. So
what does AF stand for actually?
In the TLD?
Yeah, the top level domain. I mean, the other thing I'm familiar with.
It's actually Afghanistan.
Ah, okay.
Yeah. I hope your listeners know what AF means. But the TLD AF is actually Afghanistan, which is kind of interesting. I'm surprised I haven't seen more people doing .af.
Lee, thank you so much for taking the time out of your busy schedule today and talking to me about these really interesting topics. I'm sure to follow your journey going forward with your investments. So thank you so much for this.
Awesome. Yeah. Thanks for having me.
So this is it for today, guys. I hope you found it useful. Lee is such a smart and engineering-focused venture capitalist that I think we can all learn a lot from him. And if you want to learn more about what I'm up to, you can always subscribe to my newsletter on sandhillroad.io, or you can just subscribe to the channel here. It's up to you. Cheers, guys.